Welcome to Caribbean Business Review, where insight meets impact. We bring you economic and financial updates, sharp statistical breakdowns, and data-driven insights on the forces shaping the region. Smart analysis, bold ideas, real Caribbean intelligence. This is CBR. Welcome to episode 7 of season 3 of the Caribbean Business Review. I'm Joseph Cox. First of all, let me thank you so very much for your continued support across all our social media channels and MKR Radio. This week, our special guest is Wesley Gibbings, Vice President of the Media Institute of the Caribbean. We engage in a frank discussion on whether the traditional media model in the Caribbean is on life support or mid-transformation. This in wake of several legacy media closures and mounting evidence that others remain financially fragile. And in today's CBR briefing, Sherry-Ann Farquharson discusses beyond the checkout price, tariffs and the Caribbean trade reality, a personal testimony about sticker shock in an environment of widely varying tariff imposed. But before we begin today's briefing, there's an issue that we are obliged to bring to your attention. As Bermuda, St. Martin, and the British Virgin Islands signal interest in deeper engagement with the Caribbean community while indicating non-participation in free movement, and with the Bahamas formally outside the CSME framework, an uncomfortable structural question emerges for CARICOM. What precisely is the integration model? If labor mobility, one of the most visible pillars of regional integration, becomes optional, does CARICOM evolve into a multi-speed economic space with clearly defined tiers of commitment, or drift towards an a la carte arrangement where obligations are selectively embraced? Differentiation may be politically rational for small jurisdictions, but without clarity on what is core and what is discretionary, the credibility of the regional project risks erosion. Integration can survive flexibility. It cannot thrive on ambiguity. Now, against that backdrop, let's turn to the stories we are tracking this hour in today's Market Watch and Global Pulse. Coming up in the Market Watch, BOJ cuts rate to 5.5%, Guyana set to grow 19.6%, and Bahamas deficit narrows to 2.1% of GDP. Then in Global Pulse, global debt jumps to $348 trillion, U.S. signals tariff increase to 15% or higher, and Canada's mortgage debt nears $2 trillion. All that and more this hour on Market Watch and Global Pulse. Coming up next is the CBR briefing.
Welcome to the CBR briefing. I am Sherry-Ann Farquharson. Sometimes the biggest economic conversations start with the smallest personal moments, and I had one of those recently. So I was shopping online. My cart was full. I felt pretty good about what I was getting. I knew the shipping, I knew the taxes, I knew what my total would be. So I hit checkout, and then the number jumped. Not a little. So I did what any of us or many of us would do. I went back and I checked the breakdown to see what had been added to my total. And there it was. The vendor had added a separate line item for tariffs. 25% of what my original total was had been added in tariffs because some of the items in my cart had been imported into the United States. What got me wasn't only the cost, but the approach that the vendor took, where they didn't fold the tariffs into the price of the goods. They actually pulled it out as a separate line item. And that definitely gave me pause. And it made me start thinking about, some of the bigger questions. If one tariff line can make me as an individual customer rethink a purchase, what does that do to businesses? Especially small businesses, those who are exporting to the U.S. market, as well as those who are relying on imports from the U.S. market or imports that have to go through the U.S. market. And when a company shows tariffs like that in that kind of a way, clearly itemizing it as a separate line item? Is it just transparency? Or is it also a signal that says this is what policy does to prices? Now, let's widen the lens a little. Roughly about $4 out of every $10 of what CARICOM exports goes to the United States, and a similar share of what we import also comes from the US market. So the US is not just our biggest export market, it is also our biggest supply source. And that kind of concentration matters because for decades, many Caribbean exports benefited from long-standing preferential access to the US market. And businesses planned around that stability, and rightly so. But last year, we got a reminder that stability can change. There was a brief shift in the U.S. tariff policy that introduced new duties, including on goods coming from the Caribbean. Now, we know some of those measures were later adjusted after regional engagement, but a clear signal had already been sent. When you're heavily reliant on one market, even short-term policy shifts can have ripple effects on costs, margins, pricing, and competitiveness. And we're seeing this globally, where there are other countries actively diversifying trade beyond the traditional US markets, and they're strategizing on what other options there are for them. And so I think about the Caribbean. What does this mean for us here? Because only 6 to 7% of CARICOM trade happens within our region. We have a CARICOM single market and economy. We have policies meant to support intra-regional trade, like the common external tariff. But the reality is most of our trade lens still leans outward. And I'm not saying that we must trade with our regional partners. I'm saying this is an opportunity that we ought to leverage better. The region is making moves that can support that opportunity. We see Jamaica expanding its port infrastructure and increasing cargo capacity and strengthening its role as a logistics and transshipment hub. And we see the conversations happening between Barbados, Trinidad, and Guyana as it relates to an intra-regional ferry that is designed to move not just passengers, but goods between the islands efficiently. So these are practical steps because trade isn't just policy. Trade is logistics, trade is cost, trade is whether goods and people can move easily between countries. And here's the deeper point. When we can't travel easily between the islands, when reaching a neighboring country requires multiple connections or routing through the United States, it does not tend to make us see each other as natural trade partners. We don't build that familiarity. We're not embedding those relationships, and we don't automatically think, let's source within the region first. So maybe the question isn't whether it's time. The question is whether we're ready to take the signals seriously as consumers, as businesses, and as a region. Because if I'm going to spend an extra 25% on goods, I'd much rather see that value circulating right here in the Caribbean, building regional manufacturing, strengthening supply chains, and making the Caribbean single market and economy feel less like a concept and more like something we actually live.
This is your market brief. The Bank of Jamaica has cut its policy rate to 5.5% as inflation eased to 3.9%, but the trade deficit widened to $4.78 billion US, while Trinidad's annual inflation edged up to 0.7% in January. The Bahamas narrowed its first half deficit to 2.1% of GDP. Barbados is targeting a 4.8% primary surplus in fiscal year 26-27, and S&P reaffirmed Turks and Caicos at A with stable outlook. Guyana is projected to expand 19.6% in 2026 and 21.9% in 2027. Cayman's reinsurance assets reach $101 billion up 341% over 5 years. Suriname has aligned its commercial banking sector under a National Sustainable Finance Protocol. Dominica recorded a 13% increase in carnival arrivals, while Jamaica's egg production remains 40% below normal levels. Finally, CRIF delivered a record $122 million in payouts across 14 events last policy year. Now that's your market brief on the Caribbean Business Review. For more, look for us on YouTube and Spotify.
In a world of constant change, insight is your greatest asset. At Joseph Cox & Associates, we empower innovation across the Caribbean. Whatever your challenge, we can help. We're proudly customer-centric, offering bespoke solutions tailored to every partner. From innovation and digital transformation to leadership and policy, our services are designed to deliver lasting impact. We partner with leaders across sectors, from finance and government to energy, tech, and infrastructure, helping them navigate complexity with confidence. Our work is grounded in collaboration. We connect regional leaders through powerful networks, driving change through joint research. Discover more at josephcox.org. Joseph Cox & Associates. Insight, experience, impact.
Ahead on Caribbean Business Review, our conversation with Wesley Gibbings, Vice President, Media Institute of the Caribbean, where we discuss, is the Caribbean media on life support?
One of the things, the features of regional media, and you can start from Belize, go to Jamaica, go right down to Suriname, you will find that they have been lagging behind in terms of addressing and employing the new technologies, the new spaces that have been created. So you really have not had a media industry, if you look at it as a collective, that has been keeping pace and making best use of the opportunities. In fact, there is this habit, this tendency to look at the new advances and the expansion of the virtual space more as a challenge than as an opportunity.
Welcome back to the Caribbean Business Review. I'm Joseph Cox, and today, in our deep strategy dive, we are going to be speaking with Wesley Gibbings. And Wesley is a VP for the Media Institute of the Caribbean, of course, noted regional journalist, and at one point, probably one of the shortest serving senators I've seen.
Yes.
Oh, Lord, I tell
Yeah.
you. No,
Well,
but
it's-
what we really want to speak about, Wesley, is we want to look at whether or not the traditional media model in this region, is it a matter that this thing, is it on life support? Is it going through a transitional phase? What's going on? And I cast against the backdrop of Trinidad Newsday that closed, Starbrook News in Guyana that has closed, or well, it has announced its closure. Even the largest media group in Jamaica, IJR Group, which includes the Gleaner Company, which is going back from the 1800s, that is in serious financial challenge because they have been incurring losses of $500 million at last count. But the question really, I suppose, where we start is it that the model is irreparably outdated, or is this really just a matter of transition?
No, I think you have it right. The existing media models, business models for operation of the media industry are outdated. But the thing about it is that it's nothing new. The media have always been in transition from the very early years. You could go back to the colonial era and the nature of it. And what has accompanied the changes has been the level at which automation has intervened in the production processes. And so you find that with each epoch or with each era of technological change linked to the automated services, you find that the business models have had to upgrade and to change. The thing, though, is that over time, what you have found is that from each step to the next, because we move from mechanization to automation, and into automation of different processes, and now we're into intelligent automation. That each step, the gap between what used to be and what it should be is becoming larger and larger, but within a very short space of time. So bigger changes spanning far shorter periods. Now that makes things in terms of business, the operation of business, whether it's media business or any other business. If you find that you're dealing with that level of intensity of revolution and change, then you need to adapt in one way or the other. So it's
No,
nothing new.
yeah. No, I take your point very well. But what strikes me is that I'm not, rather than seeing industry consolidation, I'm seeing outright closure. So, for example, one of the things that has always baffled me, you have a plethora of radio stations, for argument's sake. And well, media houses generally, but let's look at the electronic media for a second. What strikes me is that in all of what I have seen going on throughout this region, I'm not hearing conversations about let's consolidate tower usage. I'm not hearing let us form some sort of enterprise where we centralize our engineering functions. I mean, obviously, it would have to be specific to location and so on, but I mean, that sort of initiative where you start to consolidate, try to minimize your costs and drive efficiencies.
Well, Joe, some of that has already been happening. In
Okay.
Trinidad and Tobago, there's a lot of sharing of tower space, not only within media, but in terms of the telecoms. So the telecoms operators become, and in fact, some of them are indeed players in the game. We have Digicel, and if you want to talk about business failures in media, you have Loop that disappeared, and
Yes.
and Sportsmax, all within the same year, operated by one of our more significant telecommunication providers. So, which tells you that it's not only a technological problem or challenge, is that it does not appear to matter the level at which you're operating technologically. There are other things happening, you see. And I think that one of the things, one of the major factors is the fact that information flows have now been, we used to use the term democratized, but it's but it's hardly a democracy. What you have is a splintering of these channels of communication to the extent that the alternatives or audiences have a wider variety of alternatives in terms of where they go to for their news and information. Now, which brings us to the central point, because I come from the journalism angle on all of this, is that the end game out of all of this, or the end game that we would prefer not to see, is the decline or disappearance of professional journalism. So we are concerned about media enterprises, the media industry, insofar as they lend support for the practice of professional journalism. If that is jeopardized as it currently is, then you'll find yourself with communities, with societies that are increasingly exposed to propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, improper framing, and all of these things that suggest that those people who are producing content don't necessarily hold themselves out as having professional obligations for fairness, balance. Okay, yes, we are not flawless. The journalists can do a lot more. And at the Media Institute, we have been promoting the idea of professional development, continuous professional development, and our training has been so geared. But I think that the end game, we have to keep our eye on that professional journalism and communication are under threat through all of this.
But then how do you safeguard, all right, from the Media Institute standpoint, how do you safeguard against the proverbial race to the bottom, whereby you're in an environment that is digital now, so everybody is relying on clicks and views and this, that, and that and that. How do you safeguard your industry standard in this space where You're right. It's absolutely fragmented, and every media dollar counts, and it doesn't necessarily come from your normal sources.
Yeah, well, there are sort of implicit safeguards when you talk about improving professional standards,
Mm-hmm.
devising business models that are better equipped to address the new landscape. One of the things, the features of regional media, and you can start from Belize, go to Jamaica, go right down to Suriname, you will find that they have been lagging behind in terms of addressing and employing the new technologies, the new spaces that have been created. So you really have not had a media industry, if you look at it as a collective, that has been
Yeah.
keeping pace and making best use of the opportunities. In fact, there is this habit, this tendency to look at the new advances and the expansion of the virtual space more as a challenge than as an opportunity.
Mhm. No, I hear you. And I mean, one of the things that I recognize is that, for example, a number of the stations are trying to, our media houses rather, they're trying to, one for the print, they're trying to go behind a paywall. Two, for the electronic, they're using some of the newer mechanisms where pay for specialty on-demand programming, etc., etc. I'm just wondering though, in a call it a region, then if you will, where we have been basically raised on free services, is that business is the audience likely to adapt to the new dynamic?
You see, that's the thing. If we are focusing on the audience coming to us and adapting to what we have to offer, we're going to lose. But it's not us alone, Joe. If you look at world globally, I mean, the Washington Post recently cut 50% of its staff.
Quite
Now, this is
so.
a massive. It
Yeah.
means that they too have not really been getting this thing right, because the business model that they had applied and they've changed over the years. They look at all of the big enterprises in broadcast and in print globally. They have been experimenting and touching and adjusting, but nobody seems to have as yet come up with a formula. Now, the big techs, perhaps they offer a clue, the Metas and the Microsoft and all of those big operators that are basically scalping smaller countries such as ours by riding off our content and whatever. And that's a separate discussion, because I think that there is need for all kinds of interventions, official and otherwise, to address those things. But they appear to be, because they're also the platforms.
Mhm.
What do you do when they are the if they use the whole thing, they are the airwave or the newsprint. They are the platforms themselves, and we are now expected to adjust our operations in a manner in which that's suitable for employment on their platforms. And then when you bear in mind that they feed off content generated by us in all kinds of ways. Generative AI, for example, does not pull content out of nowhere. It's accessing
Quite so.
material. And
Mm.
because we are focusing more and more on digitizing our content, because if you don't digitize, if you don't aim at digitalization, you're going to be left behind. But the fact is that once there is digitized content, it's harvestable by these different platforms. So it's difficult. I cannot say I know the solution. And I think that the same formula applies for the big television networks, the big newspapers of the world. In Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, they have managed to hold on. And I think that some of that is linked to increasing literacy. We in this Caribbean, we don't generally have that kind of issue. And in fact, even if we had the literacy challenge in the way that others do, radio has simply been the most popular medium of mass communication from time immemorial. Radio has outlasted television, has outlasted newspapers,
Newspaper.
and in many instances, they are where people turn to in the event of circumstances that might be life threatening, that might have implications for
Mm.
people's livelihoods. So all of this social media, all of these platforms, producing content. But if you have to make a decision that's regarding your personal safety and the safety of your family and your friends and your community, the validating sources will be the traditional media. And that's why I think in the Caribbean in particular, all of us should be concerned about the state of the industry.
No, I absolutely agree. But then you say I'm trying to get to the root of where possibly where it started. Is it that they call it the traditional, quote unquote, traditional media? Is it that it lost credibility with the with the audience? One or two, they're just anachronistic, out of step, out of time with the change in market demands. Because it strikes me, why would I have all these established media platforms where I would traditionally get my news from, etc., etc. But then now transition to a popular something on social media. Why?
Yeah, because well, the thing is that the audiences have changed, and we, the suppliers, have not always kept in step. You know, the earlier question you posed in terms of the audiences being attracted to what we produce. I think that we have to become attracted to what they are interested in and a manner in which they're interested in. For example, we know that attention spans have declined.
Oh,
People
yes.
in general are no longer prepared to look at the 90-minute documentary for the most part, although my son is involved in that side of the business, and he has done very well because he thinks that there is a catchment population, a constituency that has that kind of interest, but that's not a mass interest.
Mhm.
So we have had to adapt the manner in which, but then again, as you said at the very beginning, free content reigns. And the traditional business model of mass media in the Caribbean and elsewhere has been an ability to monetize what you produce. Now, you may monetize it through audiences, you may monetize it through sponsorships and advertising. And in some instances where there's a developmental angle, traditionally there are agencies, development agencies that would support. You know, for example, we've had UNESCO support for indigenous media and community media in some countries of the Caribbean, in Jamaica and Guyana and in Belize. And so you find that you have that kind of support. So in that sense, you know, you're able to pay because, as I said, what is at stake here really is the professional services of people who are applying professional standards to the content that they produce. Now, I don't entirely agree that that the credibility issue operates in the way that you have described it, because I
Okay.
still think that legacy media still play this validating role, this role of, okay, we've heard A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. Okay, what should we believe and what should we base hard decisions on? When Melissa was heading towards Jamaica last year, you had hundreds of thousands of social media posts. But I think it is my view that what was being produced by the major news outlets at the time would have been where people would turn to because, okay, yes, they get prompt, you get faster information, you probably get more graphic, you get more detailed. Some audiences tend to believe more of what they see as opposed to what they hear and what they read. So you have visuals, but then you have the challenge of manipulated visual content, which people
Quite
need to
so.
be more and more aware of. And you found quite a lot of that happening last year with Melissa. But I think if you did a poll of Jamaicans and who they turned to for what they considered to be authoritative information on what was developing. Okay, you did have, I know you, I'm aware of the conspiracy theories and all the other things, right? And there are people who will argue with you about it, right? But by and large, I think the Jamaican population was turning to the news content operators far more ruggedly than they have been doing in recent years. And I think we need to ensure that that momentum of trust is maintained. There's an obligation on the part of content producers, journalists in particular, to practice at a higher level than we have been now and in the past, so that we maintain a level of credibility that does not undermine the industry. Because we keep saying to our colleagues in the media that your newspapers and sell and your broadcast outfits are able to get sponsorship and are able to sell airtime only because some people have confidence in what you produce, that they're getting the real thing from you. And if that is undermined, and don't forget, it's not only a matter of our poor performance at times, but there are actual focused attempts by people, both political in nature, commercial in nature, to undermine the credibility so that that vacuums and spaces are created for the entrance of their content. We need to be always aware of that.
No, point is, it's sobering, but true. At least from my perspective as well. But you see, I'm also looking at it and I'm saying to myself, the playing field is certainly not level, as strange as this may sound, because you're right. The traditional media, you're guided by, you have certain guidelines, you have to work with it. That's a given. But on your major competitors, which would be your social media persons, I don't know that there is any competing standard that is even marginally applicable to them or being applied to them. That's one. And two, even from the political standpoint, across this region, there is seemingly a decided reluctance to use the legislation to treat with it misinformation and disinformation. So it just seems like we're in a bit of a conundrum.
Yes, but because it's a very difficult space, it's extremely difficult, as you know, to legislate taste.
Very true.
A lot of the content that people feel attached to, there are sort of emotional attachments. And it is really difficult to use law and regulation to steer people away from it. Of course, you can penalize people because you know that um, common law and all of the laws, other applicable laws under communication apply to online content. So people can be sued for defamation. People can be prosecuted for breaches of statute when it comes to communicated content. So it's not that they are exempt from it. It's far more difficult. But in terms of legislating it, I think that's a losing game. I mean, I have been a long-standing anti-censorship advocate, but in part because the whole notion of censorship is increasingly becoming anachronistic. How are you going to police 1 billion social media posts per year?
No, man, of course. And I don't mean it in the sense that to that granular level, but it just strikes me that the level of misinformation and, frankly speaking, disinformation that's in the marketplace, this cannot be sustained. Because honestly, whether we want to admit it or not, literacy levels and awareness levels across this region is not where it really should be. And therefore, it is quite easy to mislead people and carry them in all sorts of rabbit holes which actually can be inimical to their own interests. So it's from that standpoint, not getting into about whether you can say this or you shouldn't this or that. No, I'm not into that because I'm also a strong advocate for free speech, but I am mindful of where the market seemingly is trending, and it's a cause for concern.
But you're hitting a very, very important nail on the head, squarely on the head, because some of the language that you use really, that's where the key is. because we pay a lot of attention to the supply side and their concerns in terms of the supply side, the broadcasters and the content generators, content creators, producers of material, both traditional and new media. But very little attention is frequently paid to the demand side. Now, that's the side that you are concerned about, quite rightfully. And that's why at the MIC, and I personally have been totally supportive of the effort by UNESCO to promote this notion of media and information literacy. Now, we do face the challenge in some countries of old-fashioned traditional literacy. Okay, there is a challenge. Even the statistics don't show it. And I said earlier, it's not really that problem, at least not to the extent that you face in other parts of the world. But there is a challenge with the old-fashioned traditional literacy. Now, to up that game, to talk about digital literacy and media and information literacy, it means that you're looking at a long game. You know, this is not a game that's going to end tomorrow or next year or the next 10 years. So in parts of Europe, for example, they have introduced media and information literacy on school curricula, not as a byproduct of social studies and so on, which is the discussion here in the Caribbean, but as a very specific, targeted program of getting children to understand what is before them by way of content, whether through traditional media or through new and social media. Now, here, what I'm talking about school children here, right?
Yeah, of course.
We
Yeah.
must take the long view with that aspect. In terms of survival of the media industry, you don't have much prospects. We have to start acting now. But even then, we have to take the long view because, as I said, the changes are coming at us very fast, and each step is a much larger leap than we have been used to in the post-colonial era. You know, if you had one technological change in with the introduction of the printing press, the next step after that, which led into further automation of the process of printing, took decades.
Yeah, true.
But
No,
now
true.
we can be here discussing this today, and then tomorrow there's a new innovation, and we have to find a way of coping with it.
Yeah. No, that part I do understand because I do remember years gone by when I used to print a commercial magazine. I mean, you'd have to go get color separation and all sorts of things going on, and those things are just out of the way now. That's just no longer part of it. But then you see, it comes down to me because when you're looking at the business of media, it comes down to me to be a point where how can call it a large media house, so to speak, right? An established media house. How can you compete in an environment where you want to have tower space? You have to, you have to have that whole infrastructure, which is incredibly expensive. The electricity rates or the electricity charges that apply to, for example, a radio or television station, most people would not like to know what those costs are because they are ridiculous. And you're competing in a space where somebody's sitting with a laptop, a camera, and a microphone, and a decent piece of software. I think all of a sudden, that's that. You know, I just wonder about the longevity of it and how can one basically, if you say, we're not saying that the traditional media is dead, far from it, but even if you're at a point of recalibration, how do you effectively recalibrate without cannibalizing the model that you had?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question confronting media all over the world right now. To some extent, we probably need to be with our laptops and a camera and a Wi-Fi link. And that's putting it at that level.
Yeah.
But you understand the metaphor that that even at that level, it's not only the manner in which you operate your business and you monetize, but it's also how you do what you do, and that is very, very important. But the thing is that I am not seeing in the Caribbean an attempt by most of the mainstream legacy media to make those kinds of changes. Those that are using a combination of traditional and social media to get their
Mm,
information out are doing so very clumsily. They have not considered the burning question of monetization. We know that the paywalls have not worked.
no.
Many of them started off with paywalls. Starbucks News was behind a paywall for a long time. And you find that the amount of revenue to be generated in order to pay the cost of running an operation the traditional way simply was not there. The consolidations that have been taking place, RJR Gleaner is one of those examples. And in Trinidad and Tobago, you have, two conglomerates that operate multiple media enterprises, radio, newspaper, print. With an online content, again, that's it's viewed as an aside as opposed to a route to the future. So, and I know there are a lot of people who have been writing about it and thinking about it. We did not have, not very long ago, we didn't have generative AI to worry about. So what we would say is, so then we have to start as traditional media using it in areas where it would be useful. And of course, everything that comes, I'm actually doing an extremely long paper, it's morphing into a book now on, on ethical application of AI in journalism. It's an area that's very few people are paying attention to it because we are already we have been using AI for a long time. A lot of the applications used by media organizations have been making use of artificial intelligence for years. Now you have generative AI that is making the whole process much easier. You would know that they're private operators. They no longer go to graphic designers to produce
That's true.
stuff. They don't go to musicians to produce music. They don't go. So a lot of these things are, and they're changing really fast. So we
Yeah,
have to
no, it's
find a
true.
way there.
It's true because I mean, one of the things that strikes me, and I'm glad there is the music, but one of the things that also strikes me is that, for example, when I see a Gleaner and Observer, Jamaica Observer, they have basically they have formed a special purpose vehicle, call it that, right? To treat with just the printing, the literal printing of the papers. That tells you where the industry really is going. And but the other side of it is that when you talk about the music now, here are the problems. A radio station of any worth, you have to pay your royalty fees. You don't have a choice, right? But there's no such restriction on social media. That's what I said. The whole cost imbalance
Sure.
is so structured that I really am curious as to see how you circumvent these issues.
Exactly. And you haven't even raised the issue of the fact that, AI generated music is not subject to copyright.
Well, that
In
is
fact,
it.
there's a US ruling recently which says that unless it's human created, it's not subject to copyright. So you don't know, we don't know where it's going to take us as well.
Yeah.
So it's-
No, it's a serious thing. I genuinely don't know where we're going with it because I'm curious. I mean, even though I know, Gan, you have said it that you're not particularly you really can't legislate people's taste. That's a given. But I'm wondering though, if to get some kind of structure, some sort of order and maintain standards. I'm not talking about calling anybody's views or whatever it is, but just to maintain standards. Isn't this whole region, shouldn't we be looking, and I'm not looking at any country now, any specific country, but shouldn't we be looking at a regional regulatory framework to kind of govern and treat with the emerging markets?
well, I like the way you put it in terms of the emerging markets, because one
Yeah.
of the big issues that ought to be approached at a regional level collectively is the manner in which we deal with the the big tech companies, the Metas and the
Mhm.
Googles and Microsoft, etc. Because as I said, they are mining our information. They're selling ads at a much cheaper price than traditional media. but they pay no taxes. They're accountable to no one really. Which regulatory agency do we have that has oversight over these big tech? Now, we're talking about people. These are companies with annual budgets way in excess of all of CARICOM put together and
Again,
multiply that several
yeah,
times.
yeah.
So we're talking about big and powerful. Now, there are some countries that have made an effort in that area. Australia and Canada are two that have looked at it in terms of antitrust legislation, for example, which would address the extent to which content generated that make use of those platforms, whether you talk about Facebook, you talk about Instagram, all of the social media platforms, whether the dominance of those does not in itself constitute monopoly status or near monopoly status or a concentration of ownership of the means of communicating using those platforms. And so there is in Australia they have applied antitrust legislation. Now, in Canada, they tried to look at the content itself, the news content itself. Not very successful because in today's world, if you are in Canada and you're prohibited from accessing Canadian news outlet material outside of the authorized newspaper
Right.
site, whatever, VPN.
No, exactly.
Switch on
No,
VPN.
exactly.
So so for us in the Caribbean, this can't be a single country approach at all. It has to
No,
be on the
I'm thinking that as well. I'm thinking that as well. But you see, when you speak about, for example, some of the large platforms, and we all know them, the Meta, the Netflix, this, that. What I'm also looking at is that for some time now we've been hearing this conversation really coming from the telecoms providers, in fairness to them, about fair share, right?
Yes.
Now, which is where they're saying, listen, you're using up our networks, you're using up the bandwidth, etc., etc. You should make these large companies should make some contribution to it. Now, on the surface, that's a fair argument. However, my concern in all of this is that, yes, we can put in place that sort of framework, but then the companies can turn around and say, no, something, the region is too small, footprint is too small for us to waste time with them. And they just geo-block us. So we actually lose access rather than anything else. So,
That conundrum is sounding so weirdly familiar with what what we are confronting in other ways right now in the region.
quite
so
so.
so but I don't think that we should exercise the option to lay over and die. I
No, it
think
can't.
that we need to make the effort. Also, I mean, it's interesting the whole matter of the telecoms operators, because as you said, they're using those chat the only way, well, not the only way, because we have Starlink and we have other means of accessing global content now outside of our own
Right.
service providers. Is the whole question of to what extent should those service providers in the telecommunication sector be responsible for what is channeled through their conduits? Now that is a thing that's occupying a lot of other countries right now, and whether there shouldn't be some premium attached to the fact that they themselves are part of this whole milieu,
Yeah.
right? And causing the stresses. So and then the ball has come back in the court of the regulators, because the regulators now I know that in Jamaica, this is being discussed. And in fact, I think in Jamaica more than anywhere else in the Caribbean, you have a regulator that's looking at accepting a level of responsibility for the sustainability of those people who come under their purview. So I know that there has been a discussion in terms of finding fiscal measures that can contribute to a support mechanism mediated by the regulator. Now that's a fairly complex process, and it will depend on what legislation you have and so on. But I think it's a very worthwhile thing to look at. But if coming back to the media sector itself and what we can do, I think that we have been sitting on our hands too long in terms of addressing what is a very urgent need. The changes are coming furiously. We are years behind, and you cannot be years behind with these changes because, as we said at the start, these things are happening on a daily basis. You have hundreds of AI platforms now that are doing all kinds of things. Um, you're probably transcribing this using AI technology
Oh
yourself
yes,
on
I
this
think
platform.
well,
Yeah,
most of course.
yeah. If I had the option of kicking in my gamma and so that I have a transcription of this, so that if Joe Cox reports on this and he says Wesley said this, I could come back to my to what I said.
No, but not telling you, but that's where it is, and therefore, because we're really out of time. But one of the questions I really have is this: in the interim, because I know ultimately where it must go, but in the interim, what are the structural reforms that are within the purview of the legacy media, the traditional media, to stave off the challenges that they face now? What is it they need to do in the interim?
I think that there are two main courses of action: individual action. And I know that most of the responsible legacy media operations are having a very close look at their operations and how they can adapt to the new circumstances. But there's also a lot of room for collective action. Now, you said at the very start, you talk about, joint enterprise in terms of some of the
Right.
infrastructure. We know that if we're going to continue printing, it makes no sense that you have 3, 4, 5 newspapers and you have 3, 4, 5 printing facilities. Of course, you'll have the threat of displacement of workers in that sector. So there's a lot that would need to be done there, but there is definitely scope for both collective and individual action. I think at the end of the day, sooner rather than later, we are going to see more consolidations taking place in terms of ownership consolidation. Um, in Trinidad and Tobago, it's going to happen. But you also need to bear in mind that it's not only the old legacy media that are coming and going. Loop was new, making
True.
use of an online platform with the
True.
support of a major telecom provider of
Telecoms.
the region. So
True. True.
not easy.
Yeah, more on, because we're not going to solve this in one fell swoop, but it is something that is, of course, impatient of debate, because the risks are significant, and we really have to get our act in order, because even now, when you look at, it's not really media in the sense of that, but when you look at some of the cable providers, they have to be cutting off a number of, they're cutting off and discontinuing airing of a number of channels, because one of the reasons is that they need to upgrade their equipment, and this thing is incredibly expensive, and they just don't have the wherewithal to treat with it at this point in time for all sorts of reasons. So, boy, more on that. More on that. Wesley
Yeah.
Gibbings, Vice President of the Media Institute of the Caribbean. Thank you so much, my friend. Good seeing you.
You're most welcome, Joe, anytime. All the
All
best.
right, my brother.
Take care.
Thanks much. This is Market Watch. We begin in Bermuda, where net written insurance premiums rose 16% to $72.6 billion. Net income increased 27.9% to $30.9 billion, and return on equity strengthened to 20.5%. Insurance now contributes 29.3% of GDP, as overall growth reached up to 3% in 2025. Barbados is targeting a 4.8% primary surplus in fiscal 26-27, while the Bahamas narrowed its first half deficit to 2.1% of GDP, with stronger second half revenues expected. S&P affirmed Turks and Caicos with an A rating with a stable outlook, backed by reserves equal to 23% of GDP. Guyana is projected to expand 19.6% in 2026 and 21.9% in 2027, though excluding Guyana, Caribbean growth moderates below 4%. In Jamaica, the central bank cut its policy rate to 5.5% as inflation eased to 3.9%, but the trade deficit widened to 4.78 billion US. Commercial banks reported a 9.4-point lending spread, with consumer credit stress rising. Reinsurance assets surged 341% to $101 billion, reinforcing its offshore capital position, while immigration amendments will grandfather existing residency applicants. In Trinidad and Tobago, inflation edged up 0.7%. Dominica recorded a 13% increase in Carnival arrivals, while Jamaica's egg production remains 40% below normal levels, with import waivers extended. Finally, CRIF paid over $122 million across 14 events to 10 member governments in 2024-25 policy year, its largest annual impact to date. But before we wrap, here's a quick look at regional currencies and market performance. CARICOM exchange rates remain broadly stable, with the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, and the OECS maintaining their long-standing pegs, while Jamaica trades at 157.26 to the US dollar, Trinidad at 6.76, Suriname at 37.88, and Guyana at 218. Haiti's gourd traded at 131.71. On the equity side, Caribbean markets were mixed. The JSC index advanced 0.8% to 346,698 points, and Trinidad's all TNT index declined by 0.82%. BISX and the BSC advanced by 0.13 and 0.20% respectively, whereas the BSX from Bermuda and the ECS declined by 0.17 and 0.03% respectively. The Caribbean Exchange Index declined by 0.03%. Top performers included First Rock Real Estate and Lasco Manufacturing, up 17 and 10.8% respectively. Biggest declines came from Pulse Investment and Supreme Ventures, down 7% and 6.9% respectively. Now that's it for your Market Watch. I'm Joseph Cox. Global Pulse is up next. This is CBR. This is Global Pulse. The United States has implemented a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act for 150 days, with signals rates could rise to 15%. The move follows a Supreme Court ruling striking down prior emergency tariffs. The European Union has paused ratification of its August 2025 framework agreement, citing legal uncertainty. U.S. officials have also indicated tariffs will remain embedded in any CUSMA renewal. The IMF projects U.S. growth at 2.2% in 2025 and 2.4% in 2026, but warns tariffs raising 0.75% of GDP in revenue could lift prices by 0.5% and reduce output similarly. Federal deficits are projected above 6% of GDP, with debt reaching 140% by 2031. Global debt rose $28.8 trillion to $348 trillion, while sovereign issuance has pushed 10-year yields near 4% in the US and UK. Energy markets remain exposed. Saudi Arabia is increasing output under contingency plans as over 20 million barrels per day transit the Straits of Hormuz. U.S. tourism revenue declined by an estimated $10 billion, with Canada-U.S. travel down over 25%. The UK will transition to digital e-visas from February, while retail crime reached 5.5 million incidents costing £400 million. Ofgem reduced the UK energy price cap by 7% for April to June 2026, lowering the average annual dual-fuel bill to £1,641. Canada's mortgage debt reached $1.95 trillion with over 2.5 million renewals across 2025-26. Panama has seized control of Balboa and Cristobal ports, appointing Maersk and MSC on an interim basis while also reversing support for a proposed global shipping carbon levy. Now turning to our commodity and international stock markets, energy prices moved higher. West Texas Intermediate crude closed at $67.29, up 3.19%, while Brent rose to $73.15, up 3.26%. Natural gas edged up 1.06%, although the OPEC basket slipped slightly. The markets were mixed. In the U.S., the Dow fell 1.05%, the S&P 500 declined 0.43%, and Nasdaq dropped 0.92%. In Europe, the FTSE 100 gained 0.59%, while Germany's DAX and France's CAC 40 posted modest declines. In Asia, Japan's Nikkei and Hong Kong's Hang Seng advanced up 0.16% and 0.95%, respectively. Now that's it for the Global Pulse. I'm Joseph Cox. This is CBR. Well, that's a wrap on episode 7 of season 3 of the Caribbean Business Review. Thank you so much to our loyal audience across MKR Radio and all digital platforms for your continued support. As always, we stand by our mantra that knowledge is strength, but information is power. Our special thanks to Wesley Gibbings, Vice President of the Media Institute of the Caribbean, who helped us unpack how digital disruption, misinformation, and big tech dominance are reshaping Caribbean media, and why survival now depends on new business models, smarter regulations, and coordinated regional action. Indeed, the strategic takeaways from the discussion: 1. The business model is broken, but not the mission. Traditional Caribbean media is not failing because journalism lacks value, but because legacy revenue models have collapsed under digital disruption and big tech dominance. 2. Credibility is now a competitive asset. In an environment shaped by misinformation and algorithm-driven amplification, professional journalism's core advantage is trust, but sustaining it requires reinvestment, innovation, and media literacy. And 3, survival requires structural reform, not nostalgia. The future of Caribbean media depends on new business models, smarter regulation, regional collaboration, and deliberate adaptation to technological change, not a return to pre-digital norms. Now, the latest edition of the Caribbean Financial Dispatch is also live on LinkedIn, in WhatsApp status, and via the link in our YouTube comments. To subscribe, email us at CaribbeanBusinessReview@gmail.com. You can listen to this broadcast at your convenience on Spotify. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and follow Caribbean Business Review on TikTok, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn. Until next week, same time, same place, I am Joseph Cox, and this has been CBR.